Jackson had guarded many strange places during his years in the Terran Expeditionary Corps, but the floating palace of Arcanus still managed to surprise him every single morning. The entire structure hovered several thousand meters above the capital city, supported by humming gravitic engines that vibrated gently through the polished crystal floors. When Jackson first arrived, he had spent 3 full minutes staring out the palace window at the endless layers of alien towers below before remembering that royal guards were not supposed to look impressed. Now he stood at his assigned position in the Eastern Garden corridor, trying very hard to look professional, while a robotic gardener floated past trimming, glowing blue vines that grew along the walls. The vines pulsed softly, adjusting their brightness according to the palace lighting systems. Jackson had asked once if the plants were dangerous. The gardener drone had replied, "Only emotionally." Jackson had decided not to ask follow-up questions. He shifted slightly in his armor and glanced at the long corridor stretching ahead. The palace was unusually quiet for this time of day. Usually by now, at least 3 nobles would have walked past, pretending not to stare at the human guards stationed in the royal wing. Humans were still something of a novelty in this part of the galaxy, but the silence did not last long. "Jackson!" The shout echoed across the corridor with the unmistakable urgency of someone announcing the arrival of either a terrible disaster or an extremely exciting game. Jackson closed his eyes for half a second. He knew that voice. A moment later, small footsteps approached rapidly across the shining floor. Princess Kessa appeared around the corner at full speed, her long ears bouncing slightly as she ran. In her hands, she carried a tiny holographic starship projector that flickered wildly as if already engaged in battle. Jackson straightened immediately. "Princess," he said carefully. Kessa stopped directly in front of him and looked up with bright determination. "You're late," Jackson blinked. "Late for what, Your Highness?" "The battle," she said, as if this should be obvious. She activated the projector. A small fleet of glowing ships appeared in the air between them, spinning dramatically while tiny beams of light fired in every direction. Jackson glanced around the corridor. 2 palace attendants were walking past and trying very hard not to laugh. "I'm currently on security duty," Jackson said slowly. "Yes," Kessa replied. "You're guarding the castle." She pointed at the holographic fleet. "And the castle is under attack." Jackson rubbed his forehead under his helmet. Technically, that logic was difficult to argue with. "Who is attacking the castle?" he asked. "The dragons," she said. Jackson looked at the holographic ships again. "They look like spaceships." "They are space dragons," she explained patiently. Jackson nodded once. "Of course they are." Kessa moved closer and lowered her voice dramatically. "Captain Jackson, our fleet is losing." "I was not aware I had been promoted," Jackson muttered, but the princess had already grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the center of the garden hall. The enormous chamber opened into a beautiful courtyard filled with glowing alien trees whose leaves shimmered like tiny stars. Small anti-gravity platforms floated between the branches carrying decorative lanterns. In the middle of the garden stood a large stone statue of an ancient Arcanus warrior. Kessa pointed at it immediately. "That's the dragon." Jackson stared at the statue. The statue was 8 meters tall. "Princess," he said carefully, "I feel it is important to mention that dragons that size usually require paperwork." She tilted her head. "What's paperwork?" "A complicated human ritual involving forms and regret." Kessa considered this seriously for 2 seconds before shaking her head. "No time. The dragon is attacking." The holographic fleet dived toward the statue. Tiny explosions flashed across its stone armor. Jackson sighed. 5 minutes ago, he had been guarding the Eastern Royal Corridor. Now he was apparently commanding an imaginary anti-dragon fleet. "Very well," he said quietly. He pointed at the statue. "All ships concentrate fire on the left wing." The holographic fleet obeyed immediately. Kessa gasped with excitement. "You're good at this." Jackson shrugged. "I fought pirates once." "Space pirates?" "Yes." "Did they have dragons?" "No." She frowned. "They should have." Jackson could not argue with that either. The battle continued for several minutes until the holographic dragon exploded into a shower of harmless light. Kessa jumped happily. "We won!" Jackson crossed his arms. "I feel the kingdom is now significantly safer." At that exact moment, a quiet voice spoke from behind them. "Royal Guard Jackson." Jackson turned instantly. One of the Queen's senior attendants stood near the garden entrance, watching the scene with calm curiosity. Jackson suddenly realized he had just spent the last 10 minutes attacking a statue with imaginary starships. While on duty, inside the royal palace, he stood very straight. Yes? The attendant looked from Jackson to the princess. Princess Kessa waved proudly. We defeated the dragon. The attendant nodded politely. I see. There was a long pause. Then the attendant said something Jackson did not expect. Her Majesty has been watching this entire event from the observation balcony. Jackson slowly looked upward. Far above the garden, a balcony window shimmered softly in the palace wall. Jackson swallowed. Well, he said quietly, that explains why the dragon surrendered so quickly. Jackson had faced hostile boarding parties, orbital bombardments, and once a very angry diplomatic ambassador who believed humans had personally insulted his species by inventing pineapple pizza. None of those moments had made his heart beat as quickly as realizing that the Queen of Arcanis might have just watched him command a holographic fleet against a stone dragon statue. He kept his posture perfectly straight. Princess Kessa, however, did not seem concerned at all. She proudly adjusted the small holographic projector in her hands and examined the fading lights of the defeated dragon. Captain Jackson, she said thoughtfully, next time the dragon should have 2 heads. Jackson nodded slowly. Next time we will submit the appropriate dragon expansion request. The royal attendant who had delivered the message cleared his throat politely. Her Majesty has not summoned you, he said calmly. She was merely observing. Jackson felt a small amount of relief. Only a small amount. Observing was still dangerous when queens were involved. Kessa looked up toward the balcony with interest. Did Mother see the explosion? I believe she saw everything, the attendant replied. Kessa seemed pleased by this information. Jackson, on the other hand, imagined the palace security report that might soon exist somewhere in the royal archives. Royal Guard Jackson, engaged in unauthorized imaginary dragon warfare. He sighed quietly. The attendant bowed slightly to the princess before leaving the garden hall. Once he was gone, Kessa turned back to Jackson with renewed excitement. Now we build the base. Jackson blinked. The base? Yes, she said confidently. She pointed across the courtyard. Jackson followed her finger and immediately saw the problem. Several large decorative stone blocks rested beside a fountain where palace workers had been repairing part of the garden wall. To Kessa, the blocks clearly looked like excellent building materials for a fortress. Jackson rubbed the side of his helmet. I have a professional question, he said. Yes? Is the base supposed to exist before or after the royal maintenance team arrests us? Kessa tilted her head slightly. They won't arrest us. How can you be sure? She thought for a moment. Because you're very tall. Jackson stared at her. That is not usually how legal systems function. But Kessa had already begun dragging one of the lighter blocks across the smooth stone floor with determined effort. The block barely moved. Jackson watched the scene for 3 seconds. He looked around the garden. He looked at the princess. He looked at the block. Then he quietly stepped forward and lifted it with one hand. Kessa's eyes widened. You're strong. Jackson placed the block carefully near the fountain. I carried supply crates during the Titan campaign, he said. They were heavier and complained more. Kessa giggled. Soon several blocks had formed what she proudly described as the command fortress. The holographic projector was placed in the center, where tiny starships now hovered above their newly established base. Jackson crossed his arms and examined their work. I must admit, he said, this is a respectable fortress. Kessa nodded seriously. We will defend it. From dragons? Yes. And pirates? Yes. And palace gardeners who may want their stones back? She considered that one carefully. We will negotiate with them. Jackson smiled slightly. The princess suddenly looked thoughtful and studied him in silence for several seconds. Jackson noticed the expression. What? He asked. You're calm, she said. Jackson shrugged. I try to be. Most soldiers develop that habit after surviving enough chaos. Kessa seemed to focus on his face with quiet concentration, as if listening to something invisible. Jackson had noticed before that she sometimes did this. After a moment, she nodded slightly. "You're the quietest person in the palace." Jackson looked around the massive floating structure filled with thousands of alien nobles, diplomats, soldiers, engineers, scientists, and servants. "That seems statistically unlikely." "No," she said confidently. "Everyone else is loud." Jackson opened his mouth to reply but paused. The princess had strange ways of explaining things, but something about her tone suggested she meant more than noise. Before he could ask, another group of palace officials entered the garden corridor. Two tutors walked with them, carrying several digital tablets and looking extremely serious. They stopped when they saw the fortress. One tutor blinked slowly. Another looked at Jackson. Then both looked at the princess. "Your Highness," one tutor said carefully, "your diplomatic mathematics lesson begins in 3 minutes." Kessa sighed dramatically. Jackson whispered, "Diplomatic mathematics sounds dangerous." "It is," she said. The tutors approached cautiously. "Princess Kessa," the second tutor continued, "we have also prepared today's social development exercises with the noble children." Kessa immediately stepped behind Jackson. The tutors looked slightly confused. Jackson raised one eyebrow. "Strategic positioning?" he whispered. "Yes," she whispered back. One tutor cleared his throat. "Your Highness, the other children are waiting." Kessa peeked around Jackson's arm. "They think too much." Jackson almost laughed. The tutors did not. "Princess," the first tutor said gently, "these interactions are important for your future role as ruler." Kessa was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at Jackson. "Can Captain Jackson come?" Jackson blinked. The tutors looked horrified. "Royal guards do not participate in noble social exercises?" one tutor said immediately. Jackson nodded. "Correct." Kessa frowned. "But he's good at dragons." Jackson leaned slightly toward her. "I believe diplomatic mathematics may involve fewer dragons." "That sounds boring." Jackson could not disagree with that assessment. Eventually, the tutors guided the princess toward the palace corridor. She walked reluctantly beside them, turning around several times to look back at the small fortress. Before disappearing around the corner, she pointed at Jackson. "Guard the base." Jackson placed a hand over his chest. "With my life." She seemed satisfied and continued down the corridor. The garden hall became quiet again. Jackson looked at the small stone fortress beside the fountain. Tiny holographic ships still hovered above it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he muttered to himself, "I cannot believe I am guarding a toy fortress." One of the palace gardener drones floated past him and scanned the stone blocks. "Unauthorized construction detected," the drone said. Jackson pointed at the holographic fleet. "Strategic defense installation." The drone paused. "Threat level?" Jackson looked at the statue across the courtyard. "Potential dragon activity." The drone processed this for a moment. Then it quietly floated away. Jackson nodded. "Good drone." Jackson was still guarding the command fortress when the palace security system decided to remind him that reality existed. A soft chime sounded from the communication device inside his armored collar. "Security report," the calm mechanical voice said. "Eastern Garden Corridor status?" Jackson looked down at the tiny holographic ships still circling above the stone blocks beside the fountain. He pressed the communicator. "Situation stable," he said. The voice paused. "Please clarify." Jackson glanced at the massive stone dragon statue across the courtyard. "Dragon threat neutralized." There was a longer pause this time. Then the system replied, "Report logged." Jackson exhaled slowly. Sometimes alien technology was surprisingly cooperative. The floating garden remained peaceful for several minutes. Sunlight from the upper atmosphere passed through the palace's crystal ceiling, scattering soft patterns of light across the floor. The glowing trees hummed quietly as their leaves shifted color. Jackson stood beside the small fortress with his arms crossed. The holographic ships still flew lazy patrols above the base. He had to admit something to himself. The princess had good imagination. And the fortress was not badly designed. It had cover positions, defensive walls, and a clear view of the surrounding area. If it had been slightly larger and contained fewer toy starships, Jackson might have approved it as an actual defensive position. He crouched slightly and adjusted one of the stone blocks. Structural integrity improvement, he muttered. Unauthorized modification detected. Jackson froze. He slowly turned his head. The gardener drone had returned. It hovered beside the fountain, scanning the fortress with its small glowing sensors. Jackson stood up immediately. Routine inspection, he said. Inspection authorization required. Jackson looked down at the fortress. Then he looked at the drone. Then he pointed toward the dragon statue. Potential dragon retaliation. The drone processed the information for a few seconds. Threat probability? Jackson considered the statue carefully. Uncertain. The drone hummed quietly. Then it floated a little closer to the fortress and scanned the holographic fleet. Simulation detected. Jackson nodded. Training exercise. The drone's sensors blinked twice. Finally it said, training accepted. Jackson gave the drone a respectful nod. Good drone. Before the machine could respond, the sound of quick footsteps echoed from the corridor again. Jackson looked up. Princess Kessa returned at full speed. Behind her, two exhausted tutors were trying to keep up. Jackson immediately understood what had happened. Diplomatic mathematics had lost. Kessa stopped beside the fortress and examined it carefully. You moved the wall, she said. Jackson nodded once. Defensive upgrade. She looked impressed. You're a very good captain. Years of professional dragon defense experience. The tutors finally arrived beside them. Both looked slightly disheveled. Your Highness, one tutor said while catching his breath. The lesson is not finished. Kessa shook her head firmly. Yes, it is. It lasted 6 minutes. That's enough mathematics. Jackson could not argue with that logic. The tutors turned toward him with the expression of people who suspected he was somehow responsible. Jackson raised both hands slightly. I have been guarding the fortress. One tutor looked at the stone structure. Another looked at the holographic ships. Then both slowly looked back at Jackson. Of course you have, the first tutor said. Kessa crouched beside the projector and expanded the holographic map. This time the simulation displayed several glowing planets orbiting a star. Jackson leaned slightly closer. That is new. She pointed to one of the planets. That's our homeworld. Another planet appeared beside it. And that's the pirate planet. Jackson frowned. There are pirate planets? There are now. Jackson nodded. Fair enough. Kessa then pointed toward the dragon statue again. That's their secret base. Jackson looked at the statue. Dragons and pirates are working together? Yes. He crossed his arms. This galaxy is becoming very complicated. The Gardener drone floated closer again and scanned the new holographic planets. Strategic simulation expanded, it said. Jackson pointed proudly at Kessa. Excellent tactical commander. The tutors were now watching the scene with the tired expression of people who had completely lost control of their schedule. Princess, one tutor said gently, the noble children are waiting for their cooperative exercise. Kessa looked at them. Then she looked at Jackson. Then she looked back at the tutors. They're noisy. Jackson coughed quietly to hide a laugh. The tutor sighed. Social interaction is important for a future ruler, one of them said. Kessa tilted her head and looked up at Jackson again. Are you noisy? Jackson considered the question very carefully. I try not to be. She nodded with satisfaction. See? The tutors stared at him. Jackson slowly lifted his shoulders. I did warn everyone that humans are simple creatures. The tutors exchanged glances. Then one of them activated a small communication device. Report to the Queen, the tutor said quietly. The princess has again relocated to the Eastern Garden with the human guard. Jackson blinked. The tutors noticed. You are not in trouble, one of them said calmly. That is comforting, Jackson replied. Kessa had already returned to the fortress and expanded the holographic map even further. Now dozens of ships floated above the tiny planets. Jackson crouched beside her. That is a very large fleet. Yes, she said proudly. Whose fleet? Ours. Jackson nodded. Excellent. Always good to have a fleet. A quiet voice suddenly spoke from the upper balcony above the garden. Indeed. Jackson froze. Slowly, very slowly, he looked upward. Queen Draya stood on the observation balcony, watching the entire scene with calm interest. Jackson immediately stood straight. The tutors bowed. Princess Kessa simply waved. "Mother," she called. Queen Draya's eyes moved from the fortress to the holographic fleet and finally to Jackson. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Queen said something unexpected. "Royal Guard Jackson." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Your fleet appears impressive." Jackson glanced down at the floating toy starships. He sighed quietly. "We are currently preparing for pirate dragons, Your Majesty." Jackson had once stood in front of an orbital cannon capable of destroying a small moon. That situation had felt considerably less stressful than standing beneath the quiet gaze of Queen Draya while surrounded by a stone fortress, a holographic toy fleet, and one extremely proud princess. The Queen remained on the observation balcony, her tall silhouette framed by the pale blue glow of the palace sky shield. Her long ears tilted slightly forward as she studied the garden below with careful curiosity. Jackson remained perfectly still. The tutors remained bowed. The gardener drone hovered nearby, apparently pleased that its training exercise had received royal recognition. Princess Kessa, however, seemed delighted. "Mother," she said loudly, pointing at the floating starships, "we defeated the dragon." Queen Draya raised one elegant eyebrow. "Did you?" Kessa nodded enthusiastically. Captain Jackson led the fleet. Jackson briefly considered pretending to faint. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the situation developed rapidly." The Queen rested her hands lightly on the balcony railing. "I see that." Her gaze moved across the courtyard, taking in the stone blocks arranged around the fountain. "Is that a fortress?" Jackson answered carefully. "Temporary defensive infrastructure." The Queen's lips moved slightly. Jackson suspected that might have been the beginning of a smile. Kessa tugged on his sleeve. "We need to show her the pirates." Jackson sighed quietly. He crouched beside the projector and activated the expanded holographic map. Dozens of glowing ships appeared again, orbiting the small planets Kessa had invented earlier. Queen Draya leaned slightly forward. "And these?" "Our fleet," Kessa announced proudly. "And the pirates?" the Queen asked. Kessa pointed dramatically toward the stone dragon statue. "They're hiding there." Jackson added, "The dragon is their commander." The Queen was silent for several seconds. Then she asked calmly, "And how exactly did the dragon become involved with pirates?" Jackson answered immediately, "Poor leadership choices." The Queen finally smiled. It was a small smile, but the tutors nearly fainted from shock. Princess Kessa noticed none of this. She continued explaining the tactical situation while moving ships around the holographic battlefield. "The pirates attacked our planet," she said, pointing to one of the glowing spheres. "And Captain Jackson destroyed them." Jackson lifted one hand. "We are still negotiating the details of that victory." Kessa ignored him. "The dragon exploded." Queen Draya glanced at the statue again. "That is unfortunate for the dragon." Jackson nodded respectfully. "A tragic end." The Queen studied the scene for a few more moments before speaking again. "Princess Kessa." "Yes, Mother." "Why is Royal Guard Jackson the commander of your fleet?" The princess answered without hesitation. "Because he listens." The tutors exchanged quiet glances. Queen Draya's expression softened slightly. "Many people in this palace listen to you." Kessa shook her head. "They pretend to listen." The garden fell silent. Jackson suddenly found the stone floor extremely interesting. The Queen's gaze slowly moved back to him. "And you?" she asked. Jackson hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he answered honestly, "I try to understand the mission, Your Majesty." Kessa nodded approvingly. "See?" Queen Draya considered this. For a moment she said nothing, watching the small holographic fleet drift above the fortress. Then she spoke again. "Royal Guard Jackson." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Have you commanded fleets before?" Jackson looked down at the tiny toy ships. "Not quite this size." The Queen raised an eyebrow again. Jackson added quickly, "I served aboard a Terran cruiser during the Titan campaign." "Ah," she said quietly. Kessa leaned closer to him. "Did you fight dragons there?" "No." "Pirates?" "Yes." Her eyes brightened. "Did they explode?" Jackson nodded once. "Sometimes." "Good." The gardener drone floated closer to the holographic display again. Simulation success probability. High, it announced. Jackson gestured toward the drone. Our strategic advisor. Queen Draya actually laughed this time. The sound surprised everyone in the garden. Even the tutors looked confused. Kessa seemed very pleased with the result. Mother, she said proudly, we saved the kingdom. Queen Draya nodded thoughtfully. So it appears. She studied Jackson once more. You understand that royal guards are not usually assigned to fleet command positions. Jackson nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. And yet my daughter appears to have promoted you. Jackson sighed. That happens occasionally. Kessa tugged his arm again. We still have pirates. Jackson looked at the holographic map. Yes, the pirates are very persistent. The queen observed them quietly. Then she asked one final question. Princess. Yes? Why do you always bring your battles to this particular guard? Kessa paused. She looked up at Jackson. Then she looked back toward the balcony. Her answer was simple. Because he's quiet. Queen Draya tilted her head slightly. Quiet? Kessa nodded. Everyone else in the palace is loud. Jackson rubbed the back of his neck. I apologize for the lack of loudness. Kessa smiled. Queen Draya remained silent for several seconds, studying both of them. Then she turned slightly away from the railing. Very well, she said calmly. Jackson straightened again. The fortress may remain. The tutors stared upward in disbelief. Kessa raised both arms in victory. Jackson blinked. The queen began walking back into the palace corridor. Before disappearing from the balcony, she added one final sentence. However, Captain Jackson. Yes, Your Majesty. If the pirates win tomorrow. Jackson waited nervously. I expect a full report. The moment Queen Draya disappeared from the balcony, the garden became strangely quiet. Jackson remained standing beside the small stone fortress, his arms still crossed in what he hoped looked like a very professional defensive posture. In reality, he was trying to process the fact that the Queen had just officially allowed the continued existence of a toy military installation inside the royal garden. Princess Kessa was far less concerned with political implications. We won, she announced proudly. Jackson nodded. That was an extremely delicate diplomatic victory. The two tutors were still staring at the balcony as if expecting the Queen to reappear and clarify that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding. She approved it, one tutor whispered. The other tutor looked down at the fortress. She approved the fortress. Jackson raised one finger. Temporary defensive infrastructure. Kessa had already returned to the holographic projector. The small starships hovered in formation above the stone walls, drifting slowly through the air like patient guardians. Jackson crouched beside her again. What is today's situation report, Commander? Kessa studied the projection seriously. The pirates are regrouping. Jackson frowned thoughtfully. Of course they are. She expanded the holographic map with a small gesture. Several new glowing red ships appeared near the dragon statue. Jackson sighed. They brought friends. Kessa nodded. Bad friends. Jackson tapped one of the blue ships representing their fleet. Then we must prepare the defenses. The gardener drone floated closer again. Simulation parameters updated, it said. Jackson gestured toward the drone. Our strategic advisor has returned. The tutors were watching the scene with increasing disbelief. You are encouraging this, one tutor said. Jackson looked at him calmly. I am managing a complex tactical environment. The tutor looked at the toy ships. These are toys. Jackson tilted his head slightly. So are most political arguments. The tutor opened his mouth, then decided not to continue that conversation. Princess Kessa suddenly looked toward the corridor. Hide! Jackson blinked. Hide? Yes. Why? The nobles. Jackson turned just in time to see three young aristocratic children entering the garden with their attendants. Their clothing shimmered with expensive fabrics and ceremonial ornaments. They walked with the careful confidence of children who had already been told many times that they were very important. The moment they noticed the fortress, they stopped. One of them pointed. What is that? Kessa stood proudly beside the stone walls. Our base. The noble child frowned. That looks like construction materials. Jackson stepped forward slightly. Strategic construction materials. The nobles approached with cautious curiosity. One boy examined the holographic ships. Is that a fleet? Kessa nodded. Yes. Who commands it? She pointed at Jackson. Captain Jackson. The noble children looked up at him. Jackson raised one hand in a small wave. Temporary captain. One of the nobles crossed his arms. You're just a guard. Jackson nodded. That is correct. Guards don't command fleets. Jackson pointed at the holographic ships. These ones seem comfortable with the arrangement. Princess Kessa activated the projector again, and the small ships immediately began flying in formation around the fortress. The noble children watched in fascination. Can we play? One of them asked. Kessa considered this. Jackson waited quietly. Finally, she said, You can be pirates. The noble children looked offended. Why pirates? Because we're the fleet. Jackson leaned down slightly and whispered to her, That is excellent negotiation strategy. Within seconds, the garden transformed into a much larger imaginary battlefield. The noble children controlled the red pirate ships, while Kessa commanded the blue fleet from the fortress. Jackson stood beside her like a very serious military advisor. The Gardner drone hovered nearby, observing the expanding simulation with great interest. Conflict simulation increasing, it reported. Jackson nodded. Educational exercise. The tutors had given up entirely and were now sitting on the fountain edge, watching the chaos unfold. One of them sighed. Diplomatic mathematics has completely failed today. Jackson glanced at the holographic map. I believe we are currently teaching advanced tactical diplomacy. The battle intensified quickly. Tiny ships darted through the air, while the children shouted orders and dramatic warnings. Pirates attacking the left moon. Fleet intercept. Dragon reinforcements incoming. Jackson occasionally added helpful comments. Remember to maintain orbital superiority. None of the children knew what that meant, but it sounded impressive. After several minutes of chaotic combat, the blue fleet finally destroyed the last pirate ship in a bright flash of light. Kessa raised both hands. Victory! The noble children groaned dramatically, but were clearly enjoying themselves. Jackson nodded approvingly. A decisive engagement. One of the noble boys looked up at him. You're good at this. Jackson shrugged. I once lost a war game against a navigation computer. That sounds embarrassing. It was very confident. The children laughed. Princess Kessa smiled quietly beside him. For a moment, the garden was filled with nothing but the soft glow of holographic ships and the laughter of children echoing beneath the floating trees. Jackson glanced upward toward the balcony where the queen had stood earlier. The window was empty now, but somehow he had the feeling that someone in the palace was still watching. He leaned slightly toward Kessa. Commander. Yes? The pirates may return tomorrow. She nodded seriously. Good. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Good? Yes. Why? She smiled. Because tomorrow we build a bigger fleet. The next morning, Jackson arrived at the Eastern Garden Corridor 10 minutes earlier than his assigned shift. Not because he was nervous. Definitely not because he suspected a 7-year-old princess might attempt to expand yesterday's imaginary interstellar war into something even more complicated. He simply believed in preparation. The palace gardens were quiet at this hour. The sky shield above the floating palace filtered the rising sunlight into soft golden beams that drifted across the glowing alien trees. The small fountain in the center of the courtyard hummed gently, while its anti-gravity water arcs floated in slow circles. Jackson walked toward the fortress. It was still there. The stone blocks sat exactly where they had been placed yesterday, forming the proud defensive structure of what Princess Kessa had declared the headquarters of the Royal Anti-Dragon Fleet. Jackson crouched beside it. The holographic projector rested in the center, inactive but waiting. He sighed. I cannot believe this is part of my security duties now. A quiet mechanical voice answered him. Security parameter adjustment accepted. Jackson looked up. The Gardner drone hovered nearby again, scanning the fortress. Good morning, Jackson said. Good morning, Temporary Fleet Commander, the drone replied. Jackson frowned slightly. That title was not supposed to become official. Title logged in yesterday's training report. Jackson stood up slowly. There is a training report? Simulation duration, 3 hours. Pirate fleet destruction, 12 units. Jackson rubbed his face. Wonderful. The drone hovered closer to the fortress. Strategic construction stable. Jackson crossed his arms proudly. Of course it is. At that exact moment, a familiar voice echoed through the corridor. Captain Jackson! Jackson closed his eyes for a second. Right on schedule. Princess Kessa ran into the garden carrying the holographic projector controller with the determined expression of someone who had spent the entire night designing a new war. Behind her, two palace tutors followed with the tired expressions of people who had already lost today's battle before breakfast. Kessa stopped beside the fortress and immediately inspected it. You didn't move anything, she said. Jackson nodded. Perimeter security. She looked satisfied. Good. The tutors approached slowly. Your Highness, one of them said, today's schedule includes diplomacy lessons with the ambassador from the Vega Coalition. Kessa stared at him. Does he have dragons? No. Pirates? No. Then it's boring. Jackson coughed into his hand. The tutors glared at him. I am neutral in this matter, he said quickly. Kessa activated the holographic projector. Instantly, dozens of tiny starships appeared above the fortress again, but this time the display was far larger than yesterday. Jackson leaned forward. That is a lot of ships. Kessa nodded proudly. I built a fleet overnight. Jackson looked closer. There were entire formations now. Frigates, carriers, defensive satellites. Where did you learn fleet formation? She pointed at him. You showed me. Jackson blinked. I do not remember teaching that. You said orbital superiority. Jackson sighed. Ah. The Gardener drone floated beside the projection. Simulation complexity increased, it announced. Jackson gestured toward the drone. Our advisor approves. Kessa began moving ships across the holographic star map. The pirates are coming from 3 directions. Jackson crouched beside her and studied the display. Ambitious pirates. They brought dragon allies. Jackson glanced toward the stone statue again. That dragon is very committed. The tutors had given up trying to stop the exercise and were now watching the tactical map with cautious curiosity. One tutor leaned closer. What is that formation? Jackson pointed. That is a defensive arc. Kessa nodded. See? The tutor blinked. You're teaching her military strategy. Jackson shrugged. I thought this was a toy. The garden suddenly filled with a quiet hum. The palace security grid activated briefly overhead as several surveillance drones drifted past. Jackson noticed them immediately. Observation drones. Kessa looked up. Are they pirates? No. Dragon spies. Probably palace administrators. The Gardener drone beeped softly. Royal observation channel active. Jackson slowly turned his head toward the upper balcony again. The same balcony where Queen Draya had stood yesterday. The window shimmered slightly. Someone was definitely watching. Jackson leaned slightly toward Kessa. Commander. Yes? We have spectators. Kessa looked upward with interest. Mother? Possibly. She smiled. Good. Jackson looked confused. Why is that good? Because today we win faster. The princess straightened proudly beside the fortress. Her long ears tilted forward slightly as she studied the holographic battlefield. Jackson noticed something again. The same thing he had felt yesterday. When she stood near him, the chaos of the palace seemed quieter. The princess moved one final group of ships into position. Ready, she said. Jackson crossed his arms. Fleet prepared. The Gardener drone floated above them. Simulation starting. The tiny pirate fleet appeared again on the holographic map, moving rapidly toward the fortress. Jackson leaned slightly closer to the display. Commander. Yes? This may be our most difficult battle. Kessa smiled calmly. That's why you're here. Jackson watched the approaching pirate ships. He nodded slowly. Good answer. Above them, unseen behind the palace glass, Queen Draya continued to watch the quiet human guard and her daughter preparing for another imaginary war. And for the first time in many years, the queen noticed something unusual inside the palace. Her daughter was laughing. The pirate fleet appeared above the holographic star map in a sudden flash of red light. Tiny ships surged forward like a swarm of glowing insects. their digital engines leaving bright trails across the simulated sky. Princess Kessa leaned closer to the projector with intense focus, her long ears tilted forward in concentration. Jackson crouched beside the fortress and studied the formation. "That," he said quietly, "is a very aggressive opening move." Kessa nodded. They learned from yesterday. The Gardener drone hovered above the projection and announced calmly, "Simulation conflict initiated." Jackson folded his arms. "Well then," he murmured, "let's not disappoint our audience." Above them, the palace observation balcony shimmered faintly again. Jackson did not look up this time. He already knew someone was watching. Kessa moved 3 blue ships into position. "Intercept Group 1, she said. Jackson pointed toward the edge of the map. "Careful. They're trying to surround the moon." The princess paused. "You're right." She shifted the fleet formation immediately. The pirate ships rushed toward the fortress, but the blue fleet curved around them in a wide defensive arc. Jackson nodded approvingly. "Good maneuver." The Gardener drone hummed softly. Tactical adaptation successful. The tutors, who had arrived earlier intending to conduct a diplomatic lesson, were now standing quietly beside the fountain, watching the battle unfold. One of them whispered to the other, "This is surprisingly strategic." Jackson glanced back at them. "Advanced diplomatic mathematics." The tutor blinked. "That is not what diplomacy means." "Today it does." Kessa suddenly pointed at the projection. "Dragon incoming." A large glowing shape appeared on the map, representing the pirate commander. Jackson sighed. "That dragon again." The dragon ship charged directly toward the fortress. The holographic fleet scattered briefly before regrouping. Kessa looked at Jackson. "What do we do?" Jackson leaned closer to the display. For a moment he looked less like a confused palace guard and more like the officer he had once been aboard a Terran cruiser. "Bait it," he said quietly. Kessa tilted her head. "Bait? Let the dragon think it's winning." She smiled slowly. "Okay." The blue fleet retreated slightly. The dragon ship accelerated, charging directly toward the fortress. The pirate ships followed. Then Kessa snapped her fingers. "Now!" The blue fleet curved around the dragon formation from both sides, trapping the pirate ships in a perfect crossfire. The holographic sky filled with tiny explosions of light. Within seconds, the pirate fleet vanished. The dragon flickered once, twice, then exploded in a brilliant flash. The garden fell silent. Kessa raised both arms. "Victory!" Jackson nodded slowly. "Decisive." The Gardener drone recorded the event. "Simulation result, Royal Fleet victory." The tutors stared at the projection. One of them muttered quietly, "That was actually impressive." Jackson stood up and stretched his shoulders. Kessa looked up at him. "We did it." He nodded. "We did." She studied him for a moment. "You're still quiet." Jackson chuckled softly. "That is my natural state." Before Kessa could reply, a familiar voice echoed gently from the balcony above. "An excellent victory." Everyone looked up. Queen Draya stood once again at the railing, watching them with calm interest. Kessa waved immediately. "Mother, the dragon exploded again." The queen nodded thoughtfully. "So I noticed." Her gaze shifted slowly to Jackson. "Royal Guard Jackson." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You appear to have developed considerable skill as a fleet commander." Jackson glanced down at the toy projector. "I prefer smaller fleets." The queen descended the balcony stairs and walked slowly into the garden courtyard. The palace attendants stepped aside as she approached the fortress. Kessa stood proudly beside it. Jackson straightened. Queen Draya studied the stone blocks, the projector, and the fading holographic ships drifting above the fountain. Then she looked at her daughter. "You seem happy." Kessa nodded. "I am." Drea was silent for a moment. Then she looked back at Jackson. "When my daughter was born," she said quietly, "the palace physicians warned me that her empathic senses would make the world overwhelming." Jackson listened carefully. "They said the emotions of others would be too loud for her." Kessa leaned quietly against the stone fortress, watching them both. The queen continued, "But near you, she is calm." Jackson hesitated before answering. "I try not to be complicated." Kessa smiled slightly. Queen Draya studied him for another long moment. Then something unexpected happened. She sat down on the edge of the fountain beside the fortress. Jackson blinked. The tutors nearly dropped their tablets. The Queen looked at the holographic projector. "Show me the fleet," she said. Kessa immediately reactivated the simulation. The tiny ships appeared again above the fountain. Queen Draya watched them drift through the air. "Which one is mine?" she asked. Kessa pointed to a larger blue ship near the center. "That one." The Queen nodded. "And the dragon?" Jackson pointed toward the statue across the courtyard. "Persistent enemy." The Queen smiled faintly. "Then we should prepare." Kessa laughed. Jackson folded his arms beside them. The floating palace of Arcanus shimmered in the morning light, while the tiny holographic fleet began another slow patrol above the fortress. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Jackson realized something strange. He was no longer just guarding the royal garden. He was part of it, part of the quiet moment that made the future queen feel safe. Princess Kessa leaned against the stone wall beside him. "Captain Jackson." "Yes?" "The pirates will come back tomorrow." Jackson nodded. "They always do." She smiled. "Good." He looked down at the glowing ships. "Why good?" "Because tomorrow," she pointed at the map, "we build an even bigger galaxy.